And it looks like we're already recording. Okay, then. So we have here tonight Amy Matthews, a body-mind centering teacher, movement therapist, and yoga teacher. Has been teaching movement since 1994. Wow. A certified, Laban movement analyst, infant development movement educator. I have a cat. A movement therapist and a yoga teacher based in New York City. And welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for introducing me. Thanks for having me. I think what I'd like to do first is what in body mind centering we call a somatization. And it's a kind of invitation to an inner experience. So I'd like to do the somatization and then see if people have questions or comments. And then I would like to tell you about some of the research I'm doing and explorations kind of in body mind centering and non-hierarchical anatomical explorations. So that's my plan. To start then, it's funny, I'm usually on Zoom calls where there are 15 of us all talking at once. So it's very funny to have it be silent. But I appreciate everyone showing up. So I'm going to invite you wherever you are to get comfortable. And you can sit, you can lie down. Can you be somewhere where you can let your attention settle inwards? And I'm not going to do anything that you need to see, so you can close your eyes, or you can look at your cat or whatever you want to look at. And can you settle into a sense of your breath and see what you notice about your breath, your inhale and your exhale. See if you can be with your breath without controlling it. There are a lot of practices around breathing in a certain way, and those are all really valuable. This is one about, can you watch your breath? Can you be with your breath without controlling it? Can you just witness the inhale coming in and the exhale going out? Can you follow with your attention the pathway of air as it comes in through your nose, travels down through your trachea, travels down into your lungs, and then from your lungs travels back out, up through your trachea, out through your nose. And when the air comes into your lungs, as it comes into your lungs, it comes into smaller and smaller branches of the bronchial tree until at the very end of that journey, it is in the alveoli, in a little pocket, a little kind of bubble. And at the alveoli, at that level of tissue, the walls of the alveoli are just 1 cell thick. And surrounding the alveoli is a web of blood vessels. Little tiny blood vessels, and the walls of those capillaries are just 1 cell thick. So at the level of the alveoli, when the air that you've inhaled comes there, the oxygen and the carbon dioxide change places. Oxygen travels from the lung into the blood. Carbon dioxide travels from the blood into the lungs. But it's not like a 100% trade-off. They don't exactly trade places, but There's some kind of balancing that we don't control directly. The carbon dioxide and the oxygen, they balance each other out, and we end up with more oxygen in our blood and more carbon dioxide in our lungs to exhale. So the oxygen-rich blood is now traveling through your body. It travels back to your heart. And then from your heart, it travels out to all the tissues of your body. So can you feel or visualize or imagine that your breath is now your blood? That the movement of your breath is the movement of your blood. And your lung breathing is still continuing, that this is another kind of breath. As the blood travels through your body, it travels from larger blood vessels to smaller and smaller. Smaller and smaller blood vessels, like a branching waterway. And as your breath rides in your blood along those smaller and smaller blood vessels, eventually it comes out to the tiniest blood vessels in your tissues. And these tiny blood vessels, they're in your skin, they're in your muscles, they're in your organs, in your connective tissue. And in those tissues, they're in your brain, they're in your bones. Everywhere that those capillaries are, there are cells, bone cells, muscle cells, nerve cells, connective tissue cells. And when those blood vessels become so small that they're capillaries, they're just one cell thick, the walls. So the oxygen then leaves the blood and it travels into the interstitial space between the cells and then into the cells. And your bone cells and your connective tissue cells and your nerve cells and your skin cells, all of the cells of your body will take in from the fluid space around them the oxygen they need and will release, among other things, the carbon dioxide they don't need. So at this level of our cells, there's a cellular respiration that happens also. Each of your cells are breathing. Each of your cells are taking in and letting go. And the cells don't all breathe in the same rhythm. They don't all breathe at the same rate. But each cell in your body is taking in and letting go. And this is not something that we directly control. This is not something that you need to do. It's not something that you need to make happen. It's something that is present in your being aliveness. Your cells are breathing. So is it possible for you to rest into that sense of your cells breathing? For a few moments to let go of the things you think you should be doing or the things you need to be doing. And in your body to be with yourself, but not controlling and not directing. How is it to trust that your cells are breathing? And to imagine or trust that your cells in their breathing are calling the blood. So could you imagine that your blood is moving because the cells are calling for their breath? And that the breathing of your cells and the movement of your blood, that it in some way calls your lung breathing, creates or invites your external respiration. So that the breathing that you're doing, the taking in, the inhaling and the exhaling from your lungs, can you rest in some way in that and not control it? And trust that it's happening in response to the breathing of your cells. And can you find your way from your cells back to your blood? From your blood back to your lungs? From your lungs back to a sense of the space outside of you, the environment around you. And is it possible to be aware of both your external respiration and your cellular breath, so that you can in some way bring your attention back out to the room around you, to the space around you or the people around you? But is it possible to keep that kind of deep rest of knowing that your cells are breathing and you do not have to make it happen? So, the end of that. Thank you for your attention, for settling into that. I appreciate your willingness to go there, and I'm curious to hear if people have questions or comments that they'd like to write, and to let me know what you'd be more interested in hearing me talk about. I certainly have lots of things I'm interested in to talk about, but I'm curious if anyone's coming in with any real desires also. Yeah, the body breathing itself is pretty amazing. Yeah. One of the things that I find in, I'm reading I'm just going to respond to people's comments a little bit. So if you want to keep writing, or love to hear your thoughts. One of the things I find really remarkable about body mind centering as practice is that we don't really talk about it as a technique, but as an approach, and that in that sense, as an approach, we can take any piece of information or we can take any idea and explore where it might take us. So the idea of cellular respiration is not a new one, right? If you look in a physiology textbook or an anatomy textbook, maybe not an anatomy textbook, but a physiology textbook will talk about cellular respiration. But I think one of the extraordinary things that our founder, the person who created Body Mind Centering, Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, did, and has really invited the rest of us to do, is to take little tiny ideas that might be treated as matter of fact and to say, what happens if we inhabit them fully, or spend a long time here and see what happens? And I find personally really fascinating the idea that I think a lot of times we use information as a way to look at how to control things, and that the way that we approach embodiment in body mind centering, at least, is as a way to trust more, maybe, rather than controlling. And I think that it also brings up some really interesting questions about what things are sometimes considered like binary or mutually exclusive, that we can then actually inhabit both at the same time. And I'm looking at, Heidi wrote a question about saying more about being aware of the cells breathing and being aware of our external environment. And I think that, like in a stressful situation, for example, and I think that that is one of the questions I have maybe about what awareness is, and if we sometimes conflate awareness and control. And I think that certainly my understanding of some stressful situations are, yeah, no, I don't want to say that. Never mind. Sorry. So the idea of being aware that our cells are breathing is not that we're making ourselves breathe. And I certainly see it happen in different somatic practices and in yoga, that, and in teaching anatomy also, that we start to think that being aware of something means somehow we're making it happen or we're creating it. And I think that it's really valuable to consider all of the things that are just happening and that we don't have to make happen, that we can have some impact on, and we can certainly create obstacles, but it's just happening. So for me, it makes the richness of the world that much greater, that that my cellular breathing is happening all the time, and it's there for me to rest into. But I'm also, I'm not, I'm responsible for it in a sense, in the sense that I'm responsible for myself, but it's not something I control. And I think that's something about having it not be something I have to control helps me consider that I can pay attention to the outer world and still have this kind of, to me, it's like a kind of humming sense of the cells are just there breathing, and there can be a kind of hum or a baseline drone. We talk about the feeling of a drone at the same time that there's all kinds of other sound or melody or activity going on. And to practice having a sense of that as a foundation, I think, particularly in a stressful situation, can then give me a kind of resource that might diminish the sense of stress if the stress comes from a feeling of the sense of stress comes from a feeling of like not having the capacity to do something, which is what some stress is about, that we increase our sense of what our capacity is, potentially. Yeah. So I'm reading Kelly's question about, I'm just going to read it, or comment, saying, thinking often of the magic of the breath as the most basic way to return to the body consciously, but also allow the body to be itself, trusting the way the body functions on its own. Beautiful to think of the cells calling for breath and feeding the blood with breath. Questioning how the quality of the breath can affect the quality of the nourishment. I think I have in my life spent a lot of time looking at different breathing practices, and for about 15 years was part of a space called the Breathing Project with Leslie Kaminoff in New York, and we spent a lot of time on breathing. And one of the things I find interesting is is the question of how many different ways there are to breathe, how many different teachings there are about there being a right way to breathe, and one of the things, one of the work that I do now, that I spend a lot of my time on now, is working with infants and caregivers, their parents and other caregivers, and teaching movement, not teaching them movement, teaching the caregivers how to hold and pick up and set down a baby in a way that does not inhibit their learning to move, because the baby will learn to move by themselves. But in the process of doing that, one of the things we run into a lot is the idea that, like, oh, babies are really good at breathing and we all need to breathe like a baby breathes. And one of the things that I find interesting actually working with the infants is that they breathe however they need to breathe for the circumstances they're in. So sometimes they breathe really shallowly, sometimes they breathe really deeply, sometimes their whole body moves, sometimes their belly moves. Babies do breathe more moving their belly than moving their chest, but that's a product of their anatomy. So babies' bellies move when they breathe because their rib cage doesn't have the firmness to offer resistance for the excursioning of the breath. So because a baby's rib cage is still really soft and compliant, it doesn't have the resilience to facilitate the inhale and the exhale. So a baby has to breathe in their belly, and it's actually apparently quite metabolically expensive to belly breathe, because the support of the rib cage is not there, not fully developed yet. So belly breathing is what babies do because it's what their physiology allows them to do. It's not what they're choosing to do because it's the best way to breathe. And their structure changes as they develop, in such a way that as they become more vertical, the kind of breathing pattern they have changes as well. And hopefully a baby learning how to become vertical goes with their expanding sensory capacity and their motor skills. So all of those things, like their breathing pattern, their motor skills, their capacity for taking in information, should all interweave to get to new levels. Anyway, I'm digressing into talking about babies, but it makes me curious about when we look at adult breathing questions and how, or like, are we looking for the right way to breathe? Are we looking for the breath that kind of lets the breath happen? And I think that exploring different ways of breathing is really fascinating, and different kinds of pranayama, different breath and different martial arts practices. But that, to me, the ultimate goal is to have my breath be available to me, whatever I'm doing. And so the quality, this is all circling back to Kelly's question about how the quality of the breath affects the quality of the nourishment. The breath that provides enough oxygen for the lungs, which then provides enough nourishment for the cells, is whatever breath is needed in that moment. So when we talk about metabolic cost of things, also taking a really deep inhale or really completely exhaustive exhale when it's not needed actually uses more energy than it offers the physiology. So taking a deeper breath than I need is a waste of energy. Now, not taking a breath as deep as I need when I need it is not getting me what I need. So the question is, when I don't know what quality of breath means exactly in this question, but if we look at the quality of the breath and we equate that somehow with the depth of the breath, like the deeper breath I take, the better it is. It actually stops on a physiological level equating to deeper being better at a certain point. Sure. Yeah. So Heidi just wrote that long sighs help relieve pain. I think the other interesting thing, very interesting thing that happens with the breath is what we end up associating with it. So if someone I trust and respect teaches me that belly breathing is the most relaxing thing to do, or that a long sigh might help relieve pain, or if I'm having a positive experience while I'm doing a certain breathing practice, what we do automatically is entrain our psycho-emotional experiences with our physical experiences. And it's happening all the time in such a way that it's a little, it's like a semantic thing that we even separate psycho-emotional from physical, like that we have different words for these because I think they're all completely interwoven. But if I have a breathing experience and an emotional experience at the same time, then I will be able to recreate that experience to the point where if I've been, for example, taught that belly breathing is relaxing, then when I belly breathe, it will be relaxing. But not because it's necessarily more nourishing for the cells, but because we have this amazing capacity to amazing capacity. We just do it, that we connect our emotional experiences and our psychological experiences and our physical experiences together. It is also true, and like it's measurable, it's true that a long exhale will slow down the heart rate, for example. And this is one of the things that people often ask me, and they say, yes, but slow, the exhale lowers the heart rate. And it's true that the exhale lowers the heart rate. The question is, does lowering the heart rate create an experience of relaxation or of anxiety in people? And when I first learned yoga, my first yoga teacher, who was, positive associations. Yeah, my first yoga teacher was Mark Whitwell. And he came out of a tradition of studying with Deskachar. And the practice was to lengthen your exhale. And that was the best thing to do. And you always start with lengthening the exhale. And that by lengthening the exhale, you will remove obstructions and all of these other things. And that it's always the way to start. And I had a client when I was first teaching yoga 20 years ago, and she would lengthen her exhale and then she would get really agitated. And I said, what's happening? And inside I was feeling like, well, but this is supposed to be good for you. Like, why isn't this working? And she said every time she focuses on her exhale, she thinks about dying, because that's the last thing you do when you die is you exhale. So it was not easeful for her to lengthen her exhale, to focus on her exhale. And I went back to Mark and I was like, it's not working. And he said, well, then adapt it to her. Make it work for her. The point is not, and this is in Desikachar's tradition, right? The point is not to adapt the person to the yoga, but to adapt the yoga to the person. So I think that when we're talking about breathing, the same thing is true, that each person might have different associations, and each person might find their own way into what breath is relaxing for them. And there are certain physiological responses, heart rate increasing and decreasing, and the vagal tone shifting, as you mentioned, Tree. But the totality of the experience in our body is also a product of our previous experiences and our associations. And so we can't, and what we choose to cultivate in ourselves, which I think is the practice part of it. So I don't think it's possible to say, if you do this position, you will feel this thing, or if you do this breath, you will have this experience. I think it's valuable to explore different things. And like Desiree saying, breathing on different vowel sounds have different effects. I think that any of those practices can be really fascinating, really, really fascinating. but then the ultimate question comes back to like, what effect do they have on me? Rather than being a question like, oh, can I have Amy's experience? That can we offer an experience and say, this is something that happens in your body. Your cells are breathing. What is your response to that? Which becomes part of the in body mind centering we talk about, but I think it happens in all of these kinds of practices, that it's a community. It probably doesn't happen in all of our practices, but that the community grows the material. And at least when I've worked with Bonnie or been with my teacher Bonnie, when she's teaching and someone says, I don't have that experience, she says, great. And we'll spend time asking everybody what their experience was, and not trying to get to one right experience, but to build up the kind of soup of experiences, so that we broaden this is really important to me, to get more positive ways to be in the world, and to move away from practices that say like there is one way to do this successfully. Because our body does, our anatomy and our physiology does things so many different ways to be successful. There's not just one muscle that does a movement. There's all kinds of redundancy in how our body communicates. So our cells communicate with each other, our endocrine system's part of the communication, our immune system's part of how we communicate, and our nervous system is part of how our body communicates with itself. But there's no cell, there's no tissue, there's no organ, there's no body system that has one role to play and only one role to play in the body. And I think the way that we have been taught anatomy and physiology and kind of biology is this very, let's discriminate things from each other and see what each thing's role is, and how do they interact, and how do they control each other. It's a very kind of controlling model that we've received also. And I find that that when we go below, or if we start to question the paradigm, or start to question what we've taught, or look at it from a different perspective, or look at something like how much cells are doing, or all the different things that cells are doing, that that it's much more of a horizontal process, our body working, and not very hierarchical at all. So one of the things we say when we talk about embryology, which is another big piece of what we do in body mind centering, is that the brain does not grow itself a body, but the body grows itself a brain. The cells grow a brain. The body grows itself a brain to deal with a more and more complex world. We didn't start as a nervous system that said, hey, I want a body to carry me around. So the complexity of the organism that we are now is a product of our cells communicating with each other, and then wanting to be able to be responsive to the environment. And I find, for me personally, that when I think about that, when I think about things in that way, that it changes the paradigm in a way. And it certainly for me opens up the question of what teaching is, and what the role of anatomy or physiology or all that information is in our work. Developmental movement. Okay, so Stuart wrote a question that I said that the important thing to do is have the breath available when I'm doing things. Could I speak about how I then cultivate that availability? And then Desiree asked a question about developmental movement that I'll answer. And Paige, affected to learn groups of things, how they interact. Yeah. Okay. So one thing, so the breath availability, I think that then in that way that it's really interesting to practice, like, can I breathe this is where one of the things I think that's really interesting about a movement practice, and a movement practice that has some form to it. So I feel like I cultivate the availability of my breath by paying attention to my breath when I do an asana practice. And when I do, like asana is my practice, when I do that practice, can I breathe? And if I get myself into a position and I can't breathe there, then I believe that any position I can get my body into, I could in theory breathe there. So if I've gotten somewhere where I can't breathe, can I step back from it, feel the movement of my breath, and then keep some sense of the movement of my breath as I move further into whatever that movement or shape is? And then the question sometimes becomes, well, I can't breathe. Like people sometimes have difficulty breathing when they're prone or they're in child's pose, when the front of their body can't move very easily. It can be hard to breathe. And it's like, oh, well, where else could the movement of the breath happen? Are the sides of the body available to breathe? Is the back of the body available to breathe? That the question can become about where could the movement of the breath happen? What are my breathing habits? And I find then exploring like different kinds of pranayama, different breathing practices, different movement and breath practices really valuable to see where I run into myself and where I might get more choices. But I feel like the end point of that practice is not to get to a place where I can always inhale top to bottom and exhale bottom to top. Like I use that as a form for exploring my breath in an asana, but I don't think it's the right way to breathe. It's just the thing I explore to get to being able to breathe, doing whatever I want to do. So to me, cultivating availability is partly recognizing what my movement habits are and seeing if they're limiting what my choices are and how can I get more choices. And sometimes I need to get, sometimes one of the ways I could get more choices is by exploring the things that are unfamiliar and seeing if I can stay oriented, stay with my cellular breath, stay organized, stay whatever kind of integrated, whatever kind of word I want to say in an unfamiliar situation. Which to me then connects right into developmental movement. And Desiree asked a question about if developmental movement has the same idea that it's not exactly the same for everybody. And it does. So when I work with infants or with adults with developmental questions, we have, like, there's a theoretical timeline about the order in which we learn skills and how skills layer together. So rolling helps with pivoting, and pivoting and rolling help with sitting, and weight shifting side to side helps with crawling on your belly, and that helps with, so we want belly crawling and we want rolling to come before belly crawling, for example, or before sitting. And so if we skip a step or if we stand a baby before they have these other skills, what we say is that, like, if we put them into positions they can't get themselves into and out of, particularly in vertical, then what they learn to do is how to do the position instead of how to do the transition into it and out of it. And so there's a theoretical set of steps that lead to being able to sit and stand and walk and go engage with this complex world. But the reality of how a baby does it, and I've been doing this work for about 10 years with infants, and I've seen more than 700 babies now. Some of them just once, but a lot of babies. No baby does it the same way. They don't ever do it the same way. There's not. I mean, every so often one baby will have like one textbook moment, but I've never seen a baby do exactly the developmental progression. Every baby I've seen has gotten up to standing and walking, and of the babies I see in the well baby spectrum, Like I've worked a few with babies with neurological issues, but otherwise, like everybody gets up to walk, and some of them sit really early and some of them sit really late. And but what I see over and over is that a baby who is supported in doing what they have the skills to do at that moment ends up with more skills in the next level. So another way to say it is that a baby who's pushed to do something before they quite have the skills to do it often ends up with some kind of holding pattern or some kind of bracing pattern or some kind of difficulty in the next level. And we all get there, pretty much, right? But that, so and I think that one of the things that can happen with developmental movement is that we can get focused on the getting there, on the getting to standing or the getting to walking or the getting to the shape. So with adults too, getting to the pose. And what I think is left out of the conversation, not everywhere, and not in the somatic and embodiment practices I think that a lot of us are involved in, but to some degree even here, that we're more focused on the thing than we are on the relationship. We're focused on the object or the shape or the information rather than process and rather than the relationship between things. And one of the places, Paige made a comment about affected to learn groups of things and how they interact, and that's what I think is learning how things interact and the relationships between things actually makes gives a whole new perspective on things. Like it's a paradigm shift to look at relationships instead of information. And there's some just amazing conversations happening about how to define what life is. And Friedrich Capra wrote a book. Well, he wrote The Tao of Physics, but he also, I'm looking at my bookshelf because I want to remember the name of the book and I'm going to forget what the name of the book is. But he worked with people doing network systems theory stuff. And he talks about this network theory of life, that life is not in the cells, but is in the web of connections between the agents or the cells or the organs. And that the cells themselves they're constantly dying and new cells are being born. Where the life lives is in the web of connections, in the relationships. And that that web of connections needs to be, he says, far from equilibrium and close to chaos, like at the edge of chaos, because that's where life is. And that in systems theory, when a system achieves equilibrium, where in and out is perfectly defined, is perfectly equal, then the system stops being alive. Which when I read that, I was like, whoa, I've been trying to achieve like perfect balance in everything. And now it's not about that. Like life is about a kind of balance, I think. But the questions that definition raises, I think, are really interesting about the need for change and the need for dynamic shifts, for change to happen, for life to be there. That if change is not happening, that if there's not an exchange of in and out or movement towards and away, a balance of imbalance. The balance is not about achieving a fixed state, but a balance is about the capacity to be in relationship to whatever shows up. Which is another really interesting thing about our physiology, because when we talk about homeostasis, what the body needs to survive, it's not a fixed state. Right? The body, our heart rate, the acid level in our body, in our blood, the oxygen level in our blood, it needs to fluctuate. And some of you might know about this heart rate variability research that's been done, but that they've, one of the things that's been measured now is that if the heart rate does not vary, if it doesn't fluctuate a little bit, increase and decrease, that down the road that leads to cardiovascular disease, apparently. And that um, people who have had certain kinds of trauma in their life, there's a kind of pattern they can create where they inhibit the heart rate variability. And that does not lead to a healthy cardiovascular system. So the ability of our body to adjust its tone to be more or less responsive is part of our health. So that health doesn't come from achieving a state and maintaining it, but about being responsive to whatever's coming up. So yes, I will find the name of that book. Someone just asked me that. How are cells? Oh, okay. My definition of teaching. Developmental patterns. Post-brain injury, balance and imbalance. Yeah. Yeah, separating the body into layers and agents. Heart rate variability, yeah. So I think that I would say Sam wrote a comment about separating the body into layers and agents and breaking it down to better negotiate. I think I get what you're saying, but I would not say separating and breaking it down, because I think that language is one of the language of like, let's take them apart and look at them as separate pieces, but acknowledging more that there are all kinds of layers and that there are all kinds of relationships, and that I mean, as an idiom, I know what breaking it down means, but I'm interested also in the puzzle of how can I say, okay, I'm going to focus on bones. I'm going to focus on my bone cells, and I'm going to feel my bone cells breathing. And that's a kind of zeroing in on something, but still somehow hold the whole. Can I hold that everything else that is also happening, and recognize that I might be attending to one part of an incredibly complex kind of orchestra of events going on. Because I think that, well, what that kind of thinking does for me, has done for me, is to lead me to acknowledge what role I play even in my own body, and then in my own embodiment. And that I might think I'm in control of things, but I'm not really in control of a lot of things. I'm responsible for a lot of things, but the model of something about the model of control is problematic, or I would rather use the word participate. And my colleague at Babies Project and I, we talk a lot about this idea of participation, about playing a role in a bigger system than we're in, and being willing to step up and lead when it's necessary to step up and lead, but also being willing to step back and follow when it's time to follow. And part of what we're looking at is also how something called fractal systems, and how large groups of like birds and bees and schools of fish, this kind of phenomenon that's called swarming, like how do these incredibly complex events arise from really simple participants responding to each other. And like the murmurations of starlings, or zebrafish. As a school, the little zebrafish who individually apparently have very little individual intelligence, and a zebrafish all by itself in the environment will not respond in a very complex way to changing things in the environment. But if you put a bunch of zebrafish together, they can evade predators, they can get to where food is, and they do it by responding to each other. And when one of the things we've looked at is when these groups of creatures, including humans, are moving around, part of what happens when they change direction, there's a new person in the front, or there's a new agent in the front. And when we've done these experiments with human beings, one of the things that happens is that when we turn it, like a whole group of people will be moving and they'll turn, and someone new will end up in front, and they don't want to lead. So they'll be like, oh, I don't want to lead. And then the whole thing gets thrown off. Or someone in the back will be like, hey, what are they doing over there? And what's going to happen with this? Which also will throw the whole thing off. And in that particular kind of setting, what works is when each person responds to what's immediately around them, and then something bigger happens. And it's called an emergent property. So these things emerge from these very, very local and interpersonal relationships that is greater than each of those local and interpersonal relationships. But if the agents, if the participants are not taking care of their individual relationships, the bigger thing won't happen. And we do certainly sometimes need in our body, or in our politics, or in our cultures, or in our education, or in our whatever, we do sometimes need an organizing structure on top. But we also need this kind of swarming intelligence to be a participant in. And that in my body, that is a huge amount of what's going on that I'm not directly in control of. My nervous system does not directly control a huge amount of the things happening in my body, but it can have an effect. And I can lead when I need to lead, and I can step out of the way when it's time to step out of the way. And to me, that idea of participating is what embodiment has to do with, and it has to do with developmental movement. It has to do with letting babies learn to move, but participating with them like they don't learn by themselves. We're creating their environment, and we're doing that for each other. So I'm going to pause there because there are just a few minutes left. Yeah, interdependence, the interdependence, the idea that independence, that we have to be able to do it alone, is problematic because it's not how our body works. And I don't think it's how our society works. So to me, this is really political. These are really kind of socioeconomic political questions too. Not to necessarily go down that road. Well, there's no time to go down that road, but I just want to say, I think that these questions about our body are also paradigm shifts that would be really valuable in our education system and in other kinds of social questions. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you guys are writing great comments. I wanted to keep going for a couple more hours, but
Yeah, we're at that time.
we're at that time.
You got a minute.
I got a minute. Okay. So in my last minute, I think I will say that if you are, I get to do a commercial for myself, right? If you're interested in finding out more about what I do, my website is embodiedasana.com. And I do teach around the world. So I travel and teach. I teach in New York. If you come to New York, come visit me. But I do travel around the world and teach. And I have a newsletter, so you can sign up for that newsletter on my website. Thank you, Tom. I also have some online courses. So I do 3 things online. I teach an anatomy class, bones and ligaments class, and I teach a muscles class. So that's two of the things. I also have a series of audio recordings called Embodied Movement Explorations. So if you enjoyed the little thing we did in the beginning, like, you could listen to me talk you through all kinds of explorations. But all of that information you can find links to on my website. And if I do meet you somewhere, or if I travel somewhere and you come meet me, please come introduce yourself. I really appreciated your questions and your conversations. And I hope to continue it somewhere. Thank you.
All right. So I have a question for you to think about for a moment. What is your number one top tip for embodiment? And while you think about that, I will go through some announcements. So in an hour, we have Jessica Graham coming in to talk about a very interesting topic of mind-blowing sex with meditation, which I definitely want to check out. The conference is connected with a charity in Russia for LGBT plus members. They've had a number of issues over there. They do not have great rights over there. And if you could donate $1, if everybody in the conference could donate $1, that would go a long way to helping them out. And also, if you want recordings for this, they will be streamed live for a week after the conference. If you want to have a lifetime access to them, there's a link in the chat. And I believe that's it. So your number one tip for embodiment.
Do less and trust yourself.
Like
yeah. Do less and trust yourselves, maybe.
Yeah. Very nice, very nice.
Yeah, that's what I'll say.
Okay, we actually have 2 minutes left.
We have 2 minutes left.
So we will start the, what do they call them? Coffee chat breakouts here soon. I understand it's a very popular thing. You all get to chat together for about 15 minutes with each other. Meet people from other countries. And if you do not want to be involved with that, I will give you a chance to log out beforehand. And do you have anything else to add, Amy?
I don't think so. Just thank you all for coming and listening, and be really happy to talk to you more. Thanks.
All right.
Bye.
I am actually going to unmute everybody so they can all give you some applause.
Sisters.
There you go.
Okay, thank you.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's
they
nice.
unmuted everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Amy.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, Amy.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure.
All right. So I will set everyone up in rooms. Oh, hmm. That actually worked out. Yay.
Hmm.